Hey everyone, and welcome back to Above the Tree Line, where we answer y'all's questions on Christianity, faith, culture, and like we've said before, pretty much anything else at this point.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Will. I do first, before we get started, I want to thank our listeners and our viewers because you guys keep sending me questions every single day. I'm so grateful. This show does not exist without your content, and you guys ask great questions. Well, most of you. If you're asking a question that we've already addressed, like go back and look at the episode
poo-poo
list.
The audience for their questions
because they're like address tattoos. I'm like, we did that.
It's a lot of content out
Address
there.
baptism. We did that.
You expect them to know that.
Anyway, today's topic is going to be fascinating, especially considering kind of my background, your background. It's something we're both passionate about, and that is going to be the separation of church and state. So I want to start with kind of a brief history, maybe of what our nation's founders had intended when they declared there was going to be a separation of church and state, because it feels like, at least from my point of view, we've kind of flipped it and twisted it, and it's being used now to be like, church, you have no authority, you have no say-so, get out of everything government related. But my interpretation of the initial reading was that, well, here, why don't you tell us, because you're the scholar in this area.
Oh, I'm not the scholar, but it's, so revisionist historians will push hard on what we're about to say. There's a lot of rewriting of what these early fathers said. Revisionist historians say, no, this is not what happened. That's what revisionist history
How are
is.
they refuting that?
They're saying that those early writings of the church, of the political fathers of our country are either fabricated by people like me, or it really wasn't what they meant. So if you walk the memorials in D.C., there's quotes about the importance of God on Thomas Jefferson's memorial and Lincoln's memorial, and
it seems pretty hard to argue.
Well, so John Adams said the Constitution will only work if we have a God-fearing, God-honoring culture, because you're putting the future of the country in the hands of people. When the people stop fearing God, democracy will not work, because you've got a motley crew running your nation. That is repeated multiple times by everybody you can name, even if they were deists. Some of them weren't Christians, but they clearly believed that the church had to be vocal in the affairs of the state, or the state would fail. Lincoln said, if we keep the offended power at arm's length, this nation will die by suicide. All right? So the separation clause of the First Amendment, I believe, and I think people who study ancient documents, like the Constitution, you look at the context, the original setting, all those things, the wording, was a reaction to Anglican churches in England that they had come from in the 1700s, and the role that the monarchy was playing in telling the church what they could and couldn't do. And so they said, we're not doing that here. And they set up a government that freed the church from the influence of the state, not vice versa. Vice versa happened after 1900. So as late as 1940, there's a text in a school text in Dallas Independent School District that uses John chapter 1 as its curriculum to teach English. That's 1940. That was the trend for the first 200 years in our country. Supreme Court decisions and legislation and the effects of lobbying of nonprofits in the 1900s got the whole thing flipped. And now it's protect the government from the church. I don't believe that was the founders' original intent. It was the church should thrive, and the government shouldn't promote the church, nor should the government hinder the church.
Do you still think that would be your interpretation if you are not a Christ follower?
I think if you read the comments, it's awfully hard. There's not a few of them. There's hundreds of them by every founder you can think of. They just believed if God was in culture, we weren't going to be okay. And the men who were leading culture had to be God-fearing men. So I think it's hard to see that and not go, well, whether I'm a Christian or not, these guys certainly believed God had a role in what government should be doing. There's a lot of people, because the church has been what it is or whatever, that don't agree with that today.
Okay, so go back to the historical...
Revisionist historians.
Okay, the revisionists. So how do they support their case if all of these writings are engraved on all these historical monuments across the country?
Well, they can say that it was taken out of context.
Okay.
That because Thomas Jefferson was a deist, he didn't really mean that. It was just he said it as a tribute to the church. He said it in kind of a high level vague kind of way, but he didn't really mean that the government shouldn't get involved in the church affairs because the church is an enemy. So they just put their lens on it. We do it with Jesus.
Yeah.
There are plenty of interpreters today who try to revise what Jesus said, looking back through 2,000 years,
Right.
because it's too over the top. So we're gonna edit what he said a little bit and make it, well, he didn't really mean that when he said it, or this was the context or whatever.
But don't you also think that's because I'm not saying this is my perspective, but as a nation, as a people, we have evolved. We are much more progressive now than our regressive forefathers. Maybe they were kind of like, and I don't believe this, but maybe they were kind of brainwashed by the culture that they were brought up in, which was predominantly Christian. And now we have evolved, and now we know more, and we're more intelligent. So we've progressed beyond that initial thought.
That could well be part of it, but the documents are what the documents are. Revisionist, forgive me for my Texan moment, but this is happening a lot with the Alamo, and it makes me mad.
Oh boy.
Revisionist historians are all over the Alamo. That number one, the guys surrendered. They didn't die fighting, which you just can't say that about a Texan.
Why would there even be proof?
Davy Crockett surrendered, because there's accounts that say, well, we think Crockett survived the fight or whatever. But
and who is going to make sure that these accounts are
the
reliable?
big one is they were fighting to protect slavery.
See how mad we get about the
They
Alamo.
were fighting to protect slavery and not protect the state of Texas, which might have been the motives of some of the guys. But there's a lot of revisionist stuff going on these days about the Alamo, which just as a Texan makes me angry. Just
Right.
Get that out there.
Okay,
So
where were we
That's all
even?
I have to say about the revisionist
You took us
historians.
down
Back
there.
to church and state.
Yes. So, okay, so we have.
I did it to you. I
you-
totally
you
derailed
just,
you.
like,
I totally derailed
Now
you.
my brain is in like San
You're, like,
Antonio,
thinking about San Antonio,
and
the
I'm thinking
poor
about the
Alamo
Daughters of the
guys.
Republic of Texas
okay.
and all this stuff.
Phil Collins.
Okay, so so we have. Do you think? Is there anything positive? So basically, now we don't have prayer in schools. We have like a moment of silence or
I
a
don't
moment of
believe
reflection.
that. I don't believe we don't have prayer in schools.
Well,
Any
we don't
kid
call
taking
it
a final.
prayer.
If you believe in a kid taking a final, there's prayer in schools.
Right.
We
But
don't
we're
have
not
official prayer in schools.
We're not inviting people
you're right.
to pray. And then we've got, what is it, Sharia? The Sharia law? I don't know if I'm saying
Sharia
that.
law is the Islamic thing.
Yes.
Yes.
But I mean, like, so we basically are saying, like, I'm thinking primarily education because that's a government institution. Basically saying God has no place in this building. We are not going to.
Ten Commandments can't be here.
Ten Commandments can't be here. Even as far as like our currency, like in God we trust. So we're saying God has no place in government institution. But I feel like maybe the people who originally decided that were trying to be inclusive of people who weren't deists. Do you think maybe they had good intentions and then it just
When
kind of got
they
carried
began
off?
to go separation?
Yeah.
No, I don't think it was it at all. A guy named, I think his name was Henry Reed, was lobbying to get veterans increased support, and a nonprofit lobbied against him. A nonprofit lobbied against him and said, this is like 1919, and said, until we balance a budget, we can't do anything. And so his veterans move was shot down. So he wrote a bill that said nonprofits cannot speak and lobby in government affairs, or they'll lose their nonprofit status. And that's where it started. And he wasn't targeting the church. He was he was like, I want to be able to help veterans. These guys are coming against me, so we're going to shut the nonprofits up. If they're not going to pay taxes, they can't speak. That's where it started. And LBJ and even Jake Pickle, later on, added to that to say churches couldn't endorse candidates and couldn't speak against candidates.
Or they'd lose their nonprofit status.
So if we want to be nonprofit, we're not supposed to speak on these things.
Right.
And that's a lot of people credit is whether some Supreme Court decisions just did a flip in the 50s, and suddenly we got to protect the government from the church. Instead of the government's the bad guy, the church is the good guy, it got flipped. And we've grown up in a world, everybody listening has grown up in a world where the separation clause is protect the government from the influence of the church. That's why the Freedom from Religion Society is named what it is. I have a constitutional right to live in a world where I'm not affected by religion. That's what they argue. It's the opposite of what the founders intended, and to affect our culture.
And I'm just thinking about how Christianity does seem to be the faith that's targeted the most by this, because it just mentioned Sharia law, and then I'm thinking about like the Islamic faith, even the Jewish faith to a certain extent. There are like if you say, I can't get vaccinated because of my faith, or I can't do anything because of my faith, as long as your faith isn't Christianity, it almost seems like, oh, that's your Islamic faith. We're going to respect that. Or that's, you're Jewish. That's your faith system. But it's almost like, well, I'm not going to do this because I'm Christian. People kind of scoff at that. It feels like it's a very unbalanced playing field.
If we did our work, Lori, we could probably find plenty of cases filed against other religions and Jews to limit their freedom of speech on certain issues. But I do think you're right that the bulk of it is aimed at Christians.
Yeah.
Because Christians tend to inject a moral emphasis in what they do, and that's what offends people, is we're going to pass blue laws so we can't sell alcohol on Sunday, whether you think blue laws were a good idea or not. I remember going in a grocery store and the hardware section was shut off on a Sunday. I couldn't buy hardware. And I don't understand why it's blue laws. Huh. You couldn't sell certain things on Sundays. And that may have been a good intention, but it may have got the wrong point. So that's why we get the resistance, because we pass laws that really affect how people live. And what they do is what they think is we're imposing on their rights.
I would also argue that Christianity is the most targeted because America was founded on Christian principles, and because the enemy knows who his enemy is,
yes,
which is Jesus Christ. Okay, so
you just need to know, a lot of the people listening will, because of how they've been raised and what they've been taught, will push back on our nation was founded on Christian principles. That is not an accepted premise anymore. Even if you read the writings of the early guys, they will say that's Christians doing revisionist history. They'll say that we are creating history that's not there. I believe the founders had a God-fearing, at least nation in mind.
Is it fair just to say they were deists?
They were at least deists, but most of them were really strong in their faith in Jesus Christ, and it's in their writings. So I think you could say it was implied we're going to fear God in this nation, and you're going to get pushback. We will, because most people have not been raised believing that Christianity was part of the founding thought of the fathers.
Okay.
But you can't have a religious vacuum. It doesn't exist.
Right.
If you take Christianity out, you're still going to have a faith basis. It could be atheism. It could be agnosticism. There's still a faith basis for how you do morality.
Right.
And so if we're going to have, why do we have murder as illegal in the country if we don't have a Judeo-Christian ethic?
Right.
So you can't have it both ways.
Right. Okay, so we have less than half of our time left, but with this subject, I want to get applicable for a second. So the application piece of this, what are we supposed to do as American citizens, as the body of Christ, the church? What are we supposed to do about the way that this church and state thing, like in your own words, has been flipped? Like, are we supposed to run for office, or are we supposed to picket? Or how do do you think there's any hope to ever reinstate the original founders' intention with us?
I seriously doubt in our lifetimes that we'll get back to what I think the founders intended, and it, without a massive revival, I don't see us getting back to the government stays out of the affairs of the church, but the church should influence culture because we have to be God-fearing. I don't see us getting back to that. But we can't be muted. So like I said, there's still prayer in schools. In Austin High School, we had a Bible study before first class on Fridays, and I preached that Bible study as a senior in high school.
That was not recent.
Well, but there, I can tell you, and you know this, there's prayer going on in schools right now.
Yeah, if the students choose, because I had,
you were saying my high school experience was not recent. Now I see what you were doing.
Did y'all have color back then, or was everything black and white?
Thank you so much.
No, the same thing. I was a major dork in high school. I used to make little T-shirts with little Bible study scriptures on them and walk around. That doesn't make me dorky, but I was dorky. But as long as the students were developing this little group on their own and the teachers had no input on it, it was allowed. So you're right. It is still in school, but the school would do nothing to promote joining this group.
Yeah, and I think your comment about running for office is a great idea. I think Christians need to be engaged in every aspect of the civic front. And I got a good friend in this city, Pete Inman, who I love dearly, who's so involved in civic affairs. He's always trying to get me to go down to city council and to sign something and be there, pray for something, because Christians have a voice and we have influence. And we have the education initiative in Austin, third grade reading initiative, as a direct result of the church's influence in the city. coming out of Hurricane Katrina. It's a great thing that happened. So I think Christians should get involved in the public square and should be voices and should lobby and should pray and should let their voices be known. Christians spoke against slavery. They spoke for women's voting rights. I mean, Christians have been huge in the change of culture when evils were going on, and we can't stop now just because a friend of mine, a consultant, says, if you don't like it, just go for profit.
Well, yeah, that was my other
go for
question.
profit.
Was we could do whatever we want if we just became for profit and
Here's
lost
what
our.
keeps people from doing that. You lose your tax deduction when
Yes.
you give.
Oh,
That's
so
when-
people would stop. You think people would stop giving because they
I don't
wouldn't
know
get
if
the
they were or
deduction?
not. In South Africa, our friend Andreas has told us in South Africa, they tax tithes. If you tithe, they put a tax on it.
People still give though.
People still give. So the whole reason for not being for profit is we want people to give and deduct their gifts. And taxes, churches not pay taxes on property, et cetera, and things like that.
So I want to push back on your Christians getting involved, running for office.
Okay.
Because as you know, this was my career path. Like it was law school, starting at the state level. I was going to be a state senator. I was going to make things like different. I was very, very involved in government. And that environment like made me, I ran as far as I ran to the church, and now I'm in ministry. I ran as far away from the government as I could because it's toxic and it's mean and it will eat you up and spit you out. It will destroy your reputation. Christians don't want that.
So that wasn't your calling, but what do we, if all the Christians bail, what happens to leadership in our culture?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the sad
But I mean,
thing.
don't you kind of think that's what we're seeing?
Well,
we're seeing like kind of an exodus of
you
Christians
and I
from
have a mutual
public
friend
office.
who says it's part of the judgment of God is he gives you poor leaders. When your country rejects God, he gives you leaders who reject God. But I don't think this is the argument some people make for putting a child in a public school. I don't agree with it because I don't think a child is fully aware at age 8 how to be light in a dark school where a teacher's got an agenda.
But you think that children shouldn't be in public schools?
I went to a public school. I think that you don't put your kid in public school as a means of witnessing unless they're really secure in their faith and they're older. But asking my 6-year-old or 7-year-old to be a light in elementary school when a teacher's got an agenda, they're not going to win. Go to public schools are fine, but don't expect them to be witnesses there until they're well trained to know how to do it and can stand up, like you said, in that hostile environment. Christians need to run for office. Christians need to lobby. Christians need to be on city councils. Christians need to be on school boards. Because if we don't, we yield the land. We yield the land. And so I think everybody listening should pray about what's my role. I need to vote. I need to give to nonprofits I believe in. I need to support people who lobby for what I believe in. And maybe I need to get involved a little more publicly in what I have to say. And you're right. You're going to be crucified if you do.
Oh my gosh,
It's
it's
gotten
horrible.
it's gotten so bad.
It is
It's gotten so
horrible.
bad.
So the other thing about like the kids being the salt and light, it just reminds me of like there's certain higher education institutions that I kind of hope my children don't go to. One of them was the one that my husband and I attended, which is the University of Texas right here in Austin. It's a phenomenal educational institution. However, my faith was put to the test over and over and over again by professors, people who were
But isn't
in
that good for you?
power
Isn't that good
over
for
me.
you?
I mean, I wouldn't. They
Did it
weren't.
make you grow?
It made me grow, but also if I wasn't as hard headed as I am, they could have shut my faith down. But I was like, I'm going to convince them that I'm right.
We
And-
had an ACF kid text me 2 years ago. She was at UT in a religion class, and that she said, "My professor just said Jesus didn't exist. What do I do?" I was like, "Can I ask her if I can come down and debate her right now?"
Right.
But she's saying, we don't even think Jesus really existed. Well, nobody of any credibility in the scholarly world, even non-Christians, would argue that. They teach that. I got my faith challenged at Baylor, Lauren. I was told at Baylor the Bible was an inspired word of God.
Oh my gosh, that's a Christian university.
Well, that's okay, but they're still teaching theory that people believe in, and so I had to do my homework. Instead of my pastor told me, why do I believe the Bible is the inspired word of God? So if you've got the character to stand up to it like you did, I think it's good for you to go to get faith pushed on in settings like that, because that's the real world. That's sixth in Congress. And at some point, our little childrenlings have to get out there and learn how to fight it up, but not at 6 years old.
So the person who asked this question about separation of church and state was also inquiring about predominantly church in institutions of higher education. So like, should the church have a place on campuses on public university campuses? Does Jesus have a place on university campuses? Is this an arena where the church should be inserting themselves, or do we honor the government by having that separation?
I think that based on what I know, there are so many organizations on campuses like UT.
Well, there are now. There weren't as many when I was there.
There's so many right now, and there's some serious Jesus movements going on state-run universities. As long as they're not sponsored by the university, they can't be shut. They shouldn't be shut down by the university. But Young Life and Crusade Crew and other things like that are really strong on college campuses, and there's movements going on. So I think 100% those should be allowed to be there and not be meddled with. Because again, I don't think the intention was you can't speak in the public forum if you're a Christian. And if we stop speaking, those campuses go further south than they already are.
What about the student who doesn't want to offend people with Jesus? Do they just keep Jesus, keep it kind of silent at the risk of maintaining a relationship with other students who don't believe?
I think relationship gives you the right to share, not the right not to share. I think relationship is why you share. I care about you. If I'm going to accept you for who you are, and I will, you please accept me for who I am. Let me tell you who I am. I'm a Christ follower. That's the best evangelism line there is.
Yeah.
A line not like sentence, but a line like angle. Is that I care about you. I want to know your story, but I also want you to accept me for mine, and mine is Jesus. And I think relationship opens that door. Better than, hey, I'm a Christian, let's fight over it. So make friends with people of other faiths and people of no faith at all, and speak into them. Listen to their stories and speak Christ in their stories.
This kind of reminds me of the other episode we did about Jesus in the workplace,
Yeah.
sharing Jesus in the workplace. So that kind of is all applicable, I think, also to students.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we actually went a little bit over on this, but I do want to
You pretty much say that every week now. You know that, right?
What?
We went over on this.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah.
So who made the deadline?
I did.
Okay, well, let's change the deadline.
We
So
went
you can
over.
say, we're under time. Look at us, we're under
You know
time.
what? We're going even further
the goal,
over now.
The goal's 40 minutes. We're under time.
It's 20 minutes. Okay. So thank you again for sending us your questions. Guys, please continue to keep the comments and questions and feedback. I've gotten a lot of feedback at acfellowship.org/podcast. So keep it coming. We want to hear from you. Thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next time.